Okay, so welcome to this little tutorial I wanted to do and have for members of my lab or other optics labs who may not know how to clean optics effectively or even how to identify optics that are dirty. Excuse me, drinking my coffee. Yeah, so we're going to go through a couple different types of optics, the different ways that you might clean them, and how to identify like when they are dirty or what you might see when they're dirty. So the first thing to start with is the really obvious one. It's mirrors, because most labs will use mirrors more than any other optical component, and these also tend to be out in the open. They're not typically in lens tubes or something like that. Now, I've got two silver mirrors here. And they're they're dirty in different ways, and so they will require different kinds of cleaning to get them clean. But I do want to make note that these are metal mirrors. These are silver mirrors. If you're using dielectric mirrors, you will be able to use different tactics and techniques to get those things clean. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one of these. You will notice I'm actually not wearing gloves. If you are really concerned about getting additional fingerprints, you can wear gloves, but nitrile gloves, latex gloves, things like that really aren't that effective at keeping dirt off of the optics, for the reason that typically in the process of putting them on, you typically get some oils from your fingers and skin on the outside, which can then very easily be transferred. I actually think they kind of feel like a false safety net and might make you more likely to put fingerprints on. Many manufacturers do sell optics handling gloves that you can use that are cloth gloves that sort of absorb oils and things like that, but I tend not to use them. You just need to be careful. Pick up optics from a surface that is not an optical contact surface, like the back of these frosted mirrors, and maintain light pressure so that your skin isn't sort of like wrapping around that corner. Okay, so if I take a look at this mirror, I'm really hoping you can see this because I don't have a preview of what I'm seeing in the camera. This to me looks like a very dusty mirror. I can see hair on it, I can see bits and particles of dust. If I take a flashlight and sort of illuminate the surface and then turn it, hopefully you can see those scattering particles on the surface. Okay, so this to me doesn't look particularly oily or dirty. It just looks like it has a lot of dust on it. And so we will do the first step in any cleaning process, which should always be to dust off your optics. Now, you never want to blow on them with your mouth. Obviously, your mouth has a bunch of moisture in it and is not a particularly clean place. And so we're going to use one of these little balloon puffers or dusters that they sell for camera equipment and things like that, but they're really nice here. If you have a compressed air line in your lab, you can also use that. And so I'm just going to give this a couple aggressive puffs. And you can see, hopefully I can see by eye, that this lens is now much cleaner. Yeah, hopefully you can see that there. And we always want to do this, even if your optic appears to have oil dirt on it, we still want to do this process first, because when we go through the process of actually cleaning the optic, we don't want dirt on there that can provide small scratches in the optical surface. So this does look much cleaner, but again, if we take the flashlight here and look, it does appear that there's still some dirt on the surface. And so we're going to go forward to the next step of the cleaning process. Now, this is going to be the first of two techniques really for cleaning optical surfaces, and it's what we call drag and drop, and you'll see why in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lens tissue. You'll see that they're oftentimes in an outer sleeve, and they're sort of placed in that outer sleeve in another sleeve. Now, you may often see people store lens tissues like this, indicating that the lens tissue has been opened, but then this leaves you nowhere to grab the lens tissues to open the package that doesn't touch the tissues themselves. So you should really store them like this so that you can pull them in and out of the casing without ever contaminating the surface that you're using to clean your optics. Okay, so we also want to try and be as minimal as possible when pulling out additional lens tissues. You really want to try and only touch the corners here, not any surface in the center, because the center is typically where you're going to be actually placing in contact with the optic itself to clean it. Okay, so for drag and drop, we need our optic to be stabilized. There's a lot of ways to do this. The best way is to use something that is sort of purpose-built for that. And so here I have what we call a self-centering lens mount. It has these 3 arms in it and a little lever mechanism with a spring inside that will sort of keep pressure on something held in there. It can be used for mounting lenses, as the name implies, but it's also quite good for grabbing onto optics to hold them in place. So now I want to try and get this relatively level, but you can see now that the optic is in. I can wiggle it a little bit, but I really have to put a significant amount of force on there to actually get it to move. And the idea here is that we're not going to be putting a significant amount of force on it when we do the cleaning. So now what I'm going to do, and to be clear, I want to make sure that there's a pretty substantial lip. I don't want these posts to be right at the top of the optic there. I want the optic to sit above that, because what we're going to do is drag a tissue across there, and I don't want anything obstructing that path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully pull out a single lens tissue, and I'm going to make sure that I'm really only touching. Now that I've contaminated this edge, I only want to touch that edge. Okay? So again, the idea here is that we're going to place the lens tissue on the optical surface. We're going to wet it with some solvent that should pull contaminants away, and then we're going to drag across to let capillary action pull all of that solvent and contaminants up into the tissue and away from the optic. So what I have here is some methanol. This needs to be anhydrous methanol, as high purity as you can get. I wouldn't actually recommend storing it in plastic bottles like this, because the solvents can actually start to leach plastics in over time, but my lab hasn't had a chance to buy glass bottles yet. So buy glass bottles and use glass pipettes and things like that for your solvents. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put 1 drop onto my optic surface. I can see that the entire surface wasn't wetted, so I'll put 1 more drop. And now I just want to smoothly and slowly pull the lens tissue. And what you'll see is, as I drag it, more and more of the solvent is getting pulled up into the lens tissue. And as the solvent is pulled into the lens tissue, it should pull contaminants away with it. Okay? So now I'm going to crumple this up, because I don't want to take a dirty lens tissue and put it back on my optic anywhere. And I'm going to take my flashlight and look again at the surface. So the surface isn't perfectly clean, but it looks much better. In this instance, I'm actually going to give it 1 more try on the cleaning. But these small surface contaminations could also be scratches. This is a mirror that was in my lab when I got here, and so I really have no idea how it's been treated up to this point. Okay. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. 1 to 2 drops, just enough to cover the surface. And then I want to slowly and smoothly pull. And hopefully you can see on the camera that this solvent is sort of getting pulled up into the tissue as I do this, taking any soluble contaminants with it. Okay, so let's check again with our flashlight. That looks about the same level of clean to me. So what I'm going to do now, to see if we can clean this even further, is try a different solvent. So in this case, I'm going to use acetone. You do need to be careful with acetone, because it will leave its own residue. So you do need to make sure that after using acetone to clean an optic, you always clean it with another solvent, either methanol or distilled water. This back down. I'm going to pop the cap off of our acetone. I'm going to place the optic in contact, and again just put 2 drops of the acetone on and pull. So we can take a look here. Again, I don't see any particular improvement, but we did clean with acetone, so we do need to follow up with one final methanol cleaning, and then I think we'll call this one done. So one thing you may be noticing is that this uses a lot of lens tissues. Oops, looks like a speaker turned off. If you are a member of my lab, I'm going to say this wholeheartedly. If you're a member of another lab, you should check with your PI, but I think they'll feel the same way. Lens tissues are very cheap compared to the optics that they're cleaning. And so I would much rather my students use 10 to 20 lens tissues to make sure they get an optic perfectly clean than to use an optic that is dirty. So don't be afraid to use a lot of lens tissues. They're not that expensive in the long term. Okay, so now I'm going to pull this optic out. We're going to give it one final look. I would say it's still not perfectly clean, but it's probably an order of magnitude better than where we started. Okay. So I now have another silver mirror. This one you can see again is very, very dirty, covered in lots of spots. This tends to happen over time. Let's take out our duster again and give it a quick dusting. We can see that the duster did next to nothing, which means that most of this is probably not dust. But you can get lots of these little spots over time as contaminants in the air settle onto an optic surface, especially if you're using ultra-fast lasers where the peak intensity is pretty high. That peak intensity can sort of stick things to the surface. Okay, so let's grab another lens tissue. And let's give this a quick pull with our methanol. So the reason we do this drag and drop method is that metallic mirrors are thin layers of the metals that they're named for. So in this case, silver. And applying any pressure is likely to scratch not only the metal, but also the protective coating that keeps the metal from oxidizing. And so we really need to use the most non-destructive techniques we can. I'm just going to do a second cleaning here to clean these mirrors such that we don't damage them further. And so this drag and drop method ensures that we're essentially putting no pressure whatsoever onto the optic itself while still getting a clean optical surface. Great. So I crumple. Whoops. Looks like we dropped our tissue. And now let's take a look under the flashlight. So, unfortunately, this one still looks pretty dirty, right? Now, this is actually the thing that we're trying to avoid for the most part is this mirror, we've actually made it cleaner, but it doesn't look like it. And the reason is because all these little spots on here, I can now tell after having gone through the cleaning, just sort of learn these things after a while, are spots where the coating on the mirror has been damaged, and so we're getting some dullness in the mirror because it's oxidized. So before, it looked like it had a bunch of spots on it, and that's true, but now we've taken those spots of dirt and grime away, and what's left now is the mirror surface where you can pretty clearly tell that there's oxidation happening. But the cleaning process has actually still worked. Okay. So that's how we clean metal mirrors, is with this drag and drop method. If you don't have one of these self-centering lens mounts, what you can do instead, what I've often done in the past, is to take something like a pair of forceps. We'll just do one sort of example here, and to lay them on the optical table, pull out my lens tissue, place it, get my solvents on, and then to essentially use the forceps to hold the optic in place while I pull the tissue. So this is a little less convenient because you have to do both things with your hands, but it still works perfectly fine. if you don't happen to have one of these self-centering lens mounts. Great. You can take a look there. Look with the flashlight, and it seems as though we're in the same amount of cleanliness there. Okay, so now what I have here is two filters, two bandpass filters that you can see, hopefully, have some small smudges on them and some bits of dust and grime. Now, you'll notice that these filters are not, they're recessed in housings, right? So we can't do this drag and drop method because there's already something that hangs over the optic. And B, they're not mirrors, which I already mentioned to you. The mirrors are thin metallic coatings, so we need to treat them very gently. These filters are what we call dielectric coatings. And dielectric coatings are very hard and very robust against sort of mechanical problems, like scratches and things like that. So we can clean them in a different way. So what I'm gonna do is take a pair of forceps and a lens tissue. But this lens tissue is much too big for what we wanna do. So I'm gonna fold it in half, and I'm gonna kind of give it a little bit of a wrinkle to set that fold in. And I'm gonna fold it in half again, and again, give it a little bit of a wrinkle to set that fold in. And then one more time, and we'll give it a little bit of a wrinkle to set that fold in. Now, what I have is a surface on the front here that I've never touched with my hands. And so I'm gonna now poke the other side to get a final fold. And I'm gonna grab that with my forceps, leaving room for the cleaning surface. Okay, so now I'm gonna put my solvent on, and I'm gonna saturate this region of the lens tissue, and then I'm gonna shake it off. I usually do this onto my arm so that I can tell when there's no more droplets flying off. And so now we have something that's partially saturated, but isn't like dripping wet. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this surface and we're going to rub it on the optic surface super, super gently in circular strokes moving outwards so that we're not leaving the lines of our strokes. And then we're gonna pull it off. Now you can see there's a little bit of solvent there. So I probably left a little residue where that solvent was. So I'm now going to take the other surface and do the same thing just to give it a second cleaning. Now the reason we rub out to the edges of the optic are because usually the center of the optic is the most important place. It's where we typically pass our beams through. And so if we do a less good job on the edges, that's okay. So now let's take a look at the surface of our optic. You can definitely see it's much, much cleaner in the center. It's still not perfectly clean, but there's some junk around the edges, and that's okay as long as we know that that's there. We can avoid that when we set up experiments using this optic. So I'm going to grab one more lens tissue. And clean the other side quickly so that you can see this process again. Okay, so one thing that's very important to note is while I said these dielectric coatings are strong, they are not infinitely strong. And so you don't want to be pushing into your coating or your optic when you do this. And certainly you never want to let the metal forceps come in contact with the surface because that will certainly scratch the surface. But if you're using a gentle touch, enough that you really can't feel that you're pressing on it, then it should be okay. Okay, so we're gonna do this process again. Okay, so I can even see pretty clearly on here, yeah, that our edges are not quite as clean as the center, and that the center could use another pass on each side. So we're gonna do that. And we can put it right here. So one thing here, you can see that my tissue folded in a bit of an odd way. We kind of want that to be consistent, so I'm going to pull that up. As long as I don't touch the cleaning surface, it's all right. And so you also notice, since these filters are housed, I can touch them and pick them up pretty easily with my hands, which is convenient for this method. Okay, now I'm going to use the other surface of my tissue to clean this face. And I can see a couple spots where I had solvent sort of pooled up, so there may be some residue there. And yeah, I can actually see that. But in the interest of time, we'll finish the cleaning off screen and move on to our last piece. So what I actually wanted to show you, this is very important, is I have a brand new optic here. You can see this because there's still tape on the Thorlabs box, okay? Now, you would think that a brand new optic should be pristinely clean, and in many cases that's true. Certainly for things like mirrors, that's almost always the case. But optics that are stored in a lens tissue like this oftentimes will have quite a bit of lint and dust on them, and you'll see it's very difficult to see if I just shine a flashlight on it. But if I pick this optic up very carefully, because this is a very thin optic and both surfaces are optical surfaces, and shine a flashlight through, now you can pretty clearly see that there's quite a bit of dust on here. Okay? So I'm going to do my first dusting, like we mentioned before. And I'm going to check again. And even now, I can still see a little bit of residue of some finger oils or some contamination. Now, this is a level of dirt that I would actually say is acceptable unless you're very confident in your cleaning skills, because it is very easy to leave additional residue on an optic if your cleaning skills aren't quite up to snuff. So if you're new to the lab and you're not quite confident in your cleaning skills, I would say this is acceptable, or have somebody with more experience clean it for you. If, however, you're feeling really good about your cleaning skills, then this is what I propose. Okay, so let's put the optic back here. Since we were going to clean it, I wasn't super careful about grabbing it with my hands, but now that we're actually going to start the cleaning process, I want to grab it with a lens tissue. And this is a little awkward, but you can get a nice clear optical surface this way. Okay, so that's how we're going to do that. Just make sure that you leave any surface you're going to use to touch the optic facing up, not placed down on the table or anything like that. Okay. Now, these are also thin coatings, so ideally we would do a drag and drop method, but the optic itself is actually too thin to do that. There's really no way to put it down, and it's optical. It has optical surfaces on both sides, so you can't put it directly on the table or anything like that. So we're going to have to use our method with the forceps. Okay. So I'm going to, again, like I mentioned last time, if I can get the forceps in there, I'm going to straighten that out a little bit, and I'm just going to grab onto it. We will apply our solvent, shake off the excess, and then quickly, before that dries out, I'm going to grab my optic and the lens tissue that I'm using to hold it. So you can see why this is a little bit more awkward, because my lens tissue is sort of in the way, but I also have sort of clear and unobstructed access to the entire optic. There's no mounting on the outer edges, so that is a nice convenience. Okay, so I'm going to be very careful and flip this over. I would not recommend you do this barehanded unless you're very comfortable handling optics. And now we'll clean the other side. Okay, so now let's take a look. Okay, so again, I'm very comfortable handling optics, so I'm gonna grab it with my fingers. I know to put very little pressure on there. But we can see there's still some little bits of dust. I'll probably want to clean this 1 or 2 more times to get the rest of that off, but the optic is much cleaner than it started out. Okay, so that's really how you clean optics, and that's how I prefer that you do it in my lab. As for things that are a little bit more complex than this, things like lenses or curved mirrors or gratings, the way to clean them is significantly more complex and something you'll probably run into less often. So we're not going to cover that today, maybe in a future video. As always, if you're a member of my lab, please feel free to just come and ask me questions or ask me to show you how to do this. If you're not, I guess I'm going to be posting this to YouTube, so you can leave a comment and I will try and be aware of what that looks like and answer people if they have questions. Also, I'm not a formal expert in lens or optic cleaning in particular, so if you have advice on how I could improve my own technique, that's welcome too. Okay, thanks for watching.